Okay, we are going to finish up the evolution section with this last video, and we're going to look at some more evidence to support the theory of evolution. Now, the theory of evolution is really a simple idea, as hopefully you've learned in these last few slides that we've looked at. The idea of evolution is very simple. It's the idea that an organism has genetic traits which they get from their parents, right? So you've inherited your genetic traits from your parents, and those genetic traits are called adaptations. They're going to help you survive in your environment. If they don't help you survive, well, then that could become something that's dangerous and could be a problem. But if they do help you survive, you're going to be able to survive, mate, and pass on your trait to the next generation. So if having 5 fingers is an advantage and it allows you to survive in a rough world, chances are you're going to survive and have an offspring. And if you had 5 fingers, chances are your kid's going to have 5 fingers. And that's going to continue on down the line. Now, we talked about the idea of homologous structures where you have two organisms that have the same bones that make them up. That's really strong evidence to say that they came from the same place, right? We talked about analogous structures is the idea that you have two species that have two structures that are not the same structurally, but they have the same job, right? So for example, think of a bird and a butterfly, right? A bird has a wing, a butterfly has a wing, but they are very different structurally. If you dissect a bird, it has bones, it has muscle, it has feathers. If you dissect a wing of a butterfly, there's not a whole lot there. It's just some connective tissue. There's no bones, there's no obvious muscle there. They're very different structurally. But why do they look the same? Because they both evolved for flight. So birds and butterflies, even though they're different, they evolved to fly. So they have similar structures. So that's evidence of evolution because it shows you that even though these two animals are very different from each other, an insect and a bird, they look similar because they've evolved to have the same structures, the same function, I should say. Another good example would be a whale and a fish, right? Whales are mammals, fish are not mammals, they're fish, and they look very similar because they both evolved for underwater living. So that's a really good evidence for evolution, in my opinion. The next one is something that you probably are familiar with, but you may just not have known the name before, and that is called a vestigial structure. So a vestigial structure is good evidence for evolution because what it does is it links an organism to its evolutionary past. So what do I mean by that? Well, we all have something called a tailbone or a coccyx, right? And the coccyx is the bone at the end of your spinal column, and you're sitting on it right now. If you're sitting down, it's a little extension off of your vertebrae called the coccyx. And what it is it's the beginning of a tail. Now, humans are sometimes born with tails, believe it or not. If you take a look at this PowerPoint here, you can see this little baby has a tail. Now, in certain countries, they might keep those tails, but in most places, they'll remove a tail because it doesn't serve a purpose. It could be, it could affect the kid's life, obviously, so they won't leave it on. But tails still exist. And what's a tail for? Why do tails exist? Well, if you have a cat and you've ever seen your cat walking across the top of the couch or on a ledge, you've probably seen its tail moving back and forth. Imagine walking on a balance beam right now. Close your eyes and imagine you're walking on a balance beam. If you think of that, you probably also imagine your arms out at your sides, right? You have each arm extended out from the sides of your body, and you use those arms to balance yourself as you go across the balance beam. Well, that is exactly what a tail does. A tail is used to balance. You move the tail to one side if you start to shift your weight. They're also used to hang off of things. If you've ever seen tails, you can see they have a lot of purposes. Well, we don't need tails. We live on the ground. We don't live in trees. But why do we still have a tailbone? Because we evolved from an organism that did have a tail. Another great example would be a whale. If you take a look at this image here, this is a drawing, obviously, but whales actually have a small pelvic bone that is based off of, it's right around the place where their hips would be. And what that does is it shows evidence that whales at one point actually had 4 legs. There's a movie that I usually show, and I don't think we'll have time to get to it in this environment. I don't even know how effective it'll be, but it's called Great Transformations. And what it does is it follows the idea, there's fossil evidence that whales at one point lived on land and they had 4 legs. They actually look kind of like a wolf. So that bone there is just a really strong piece of evidence that at one point shows that whales at one point had 4 legs. So that's really good evidence of evolution because you're seeing a structure. It would be like if you had a car, and on that car, there's a hitch there. you know at some point there is a hitch there because that hitch could be used to connect to a trailer. It just shows that there's something else going on there. Okay. Embryological evidence, it's really just, this one is, if you look at this, you can see it right there. This is a bunch of different animals. So these are 8 different animals, and those animals are a fish, a salamander, a tortoise, a chicken, a hog, a calf, a cow, a rabbit, and a human. Now, I know these are drawings, but they're based off of actual anatomical drawings. If you take a look at that first row here, if you look at this first row, and you look at them, they all look the same, right? These all, I mean, there's some slight differences, but if I said which one is the human, which one is the fish, which one is the cow, I don't think you'd be able to tell from this top row. They all kind of look the same. And then a little farther along in development, you can see they start to differentiate and they start to look a little bit different. But at this level, especially down here at the mammals, they all look very much the same still. Now you're starting to see some differences between the fish and the salamander, but they still look very similar. And then you get to the last one, and it's this bottom row here, and that's when they start to look different. But the fact that they all started the same is a really strong indicator that they've all evolved from a similar ancestor. They all start at the same point. So it's just a really good correlation. It shows a connection between these species. This next one is the best evidence. If you have any doubts about evolutionary theory at this point, it's hard to argue with this one. So the thing about evolution, the reason why I like to teach it last is because it really brings everything together. Evolution is the idea that species are going to evolve based on their environment. But the way that works is through DNA, right? And we learned all about DNA. And what DNA is it's a code for making proteins. We learned all about protein synthesis, right? You take amino acids, you read the code, those amino acids get put together in a certain order, and you get a protein. And then that protein has a job. Our body's made up of all different types of proteins, and every protein has a job. So for example, we have enzymes that are proteins. Let's say I had an enzyme that let me digest milk. You've all heard of it before, lactase, right? We talked about it. So somebody who's lactose intolerant can't digest milk. Well, let's say all of a sudden the only food source we have is milk. Well, people that are lactose intolerant, now they're in a position where I'm lactose intolerant. I might die. I might not be able to pass on my trait to my offspring. So depending on, it could be anything. We don't know what the advantage is going to be, and we don't know what trait is going to be a disadvantage. But what we can see is when you can look at something's DNA, you can compare DNA from one organism to another. And now it's very easy to look at an organism's DNA. So when you take two different organisms and you compare their DNA, the more similar their DNA is, the more similar they are on an evolutionary scale. For example, DNA in chimps and humans are 99% the same. That is such a, if I gave you 2 books and those 2 books had 99% the same letters in the same, order, you would assume that those books are from the same person, right? If there's only 1% different, that is exactly what we're seeing here. And then the last one is going to be something called a transitional species. And transitional species are interesting because what you're seeing there is you're seeing an organism at the point when it's probably going to start to veer off and become a very different looking organism. A really good example of that is something called the Archaeopteryx. And the Archaeopteryx was a dinosaur, but it's one of the first examples of where they think that dinosaurs could have broken off and gone into an avian, which was birds, right? So if you take a look at this fossil, this is an actual fossil, you can see very easily, you can see the feathers there. So that's, if you look at this organism, you can see it has characteristics of birds and reptiles. So it has reptilian claws, it has a reptilian face, but it has feathers, which are going to be much like a bird. So it's a really good example of a species that is changing. You guys are probably familiar with the duck-billed platypus, right? A duck-billed platypus is an example of a transitional species that we live with today. They have characteristics of birds, they have characteristics of reptiles, and they have characteristics of mammals. I think technically they're mammals, actually, but they have examples of many different species. And if one of those ends up being beneficial over time, at one point, duck-billed platypuses might look a lot like one of those things. But right now, they have a bunch of characteristics that allow them to go into a bunch of different directions. And finally, bacterial evolution in action. Bacteria is a great indicator of evolution because you can see it evolve. And again, it's scary. We're dealing with this right now. Now, viruses are different than bacteria, but any organism like a virus or a bacteria, because it can evolve so quickly, they only live a very short amount of time. Bacteria maybe lives hours or days, and it can replicate so quickly. You can have an organism evolve so fast that it can survive a lot of different situations. Bacteria has been around a lot longer than we are. Have been, I should say, and it's going to be around a lot longer after us. And the reason why is because it can evolve so quickly. One great example is antibiotic resistance. We take antibiotics all wrong in this country, or at least a lot of people do. I shouldn't say everybody does. When you take an antibiotic, you need to take all of it. So if it's a 2-week antibiotic and you take it for, let's say, 8 days and you feel better and you stop taking it, you've just contributed to the problem. And here's why. Chances are you haven't killed all the bacteria. Chances are you've killed enough bacteria to feel better. And the bacteria that's left behind now is not killed by the antibiotic. Well, guess what bacteria you just left behind? You left behind the strongest bacteria. You left behind the bacteria that was able to resist the antibiotic. And guess what's going to happen to that bacteria? It's going to replicate. So while you might have felt better, you've just basically built a harsher, stronger bacteria. And if that bacteria gets out, it's going to then be able to spread, and we can't fight it off with our antibiotics. Great example is MRSA. You probably heard of MRSA before. It's a resistant strain of bacteria which can resist our antibiotics. So if you get MRSA, it could be very deadly. So if you, like, for example, if you have a different, like pneumonia, you can take an antibiotic and we can fight it off, hopefully. But MRSA, on the other hand, if you have that, you can't fight it off because our antibiotics don't work. They've evolved to be able to resist it. So it's another great example of how evolution occurs. You can actually see bacteria evolving. And I think that's it. Okay, so just to kind of wrap this whole thing up, evolution is everything we've talked about in action. You're seeing it happen. You're seeing bacteria evolving in that example there, but you're seeing proteins being chosen based on how well they work. The better suited an organism for its environment, the better chance it has of passing on its genes. And when it passes on its genes, it's passing on the instructions on how to make proteins. That's all it is. So hopefully that made sense and it brought everything together. All right, guys, thank you very much.